Well, hello and blessings to all, and welcome to this week's lesson in our study of the book of Genesis. This is lesson 10, and this week's lesson is entitled Joseph's Reconciliation. It starts in chapters 42, verse 1 through 47, verse 31. Well, let's set the place of the passage for this week. Stories of reconciliation, actually, they dominate the book of Genesis. We've already seen the story of Jacob's reconciliation with Esau. In Genesis 42 through 47, we see Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers and reunion with his father. This story shows the end result of Joseph's experience in the dungeon and the fruit of the ongoing activity of God's grace in Joseph's life. Now, overall, the journey to Egypt in this section fulfills God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 15, verses 12 through 16, and it sets the stage for the Exodus that you read about later. Well, what's the big picture in this lesson today? Well, the big picture is that Joseph reconciles with his brothers and brings his family down to Egypt. That's the big picture. Well, it asks us to read through chapter 42 through 47, which we've done, and then interact with the questions in our lesson today. Well, let's look at our notes, and we'll open up with them. Famine, that's what drives the sons of Israel to Egypt again, just as famine drove Abraham to Egypt back in Genesis 12, verse 10, and Isaac toward Egypt, though he sojourns in Gerar instead in Genesis 26, 1 through 4. So famine drives the sons of Israel to Egypt to buy grain. Joseph's dream that his brothers would bow down to him is fulfilled in Genesis 42:6. Read through chapters 42 through 44 and jot down notes on how the pain and scars from the past still affect the people in Genesis, Jacob or Israel, Joseph, Reuben, and Judah, which we've done. Now, Joseph clearly struggles with conflicted emotions towards his brothers through chapters 42 through 44. How do we see this? Well, see it in several ways, and to give a little synopsis, we'll look at this briefly. Basically, shortage of food, and Canaan forces Jacob to send his sons to Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, remains at home, for Jacob fears losing him too. When Joseph finally encounters his brothers again, he deliberately conceals his identity. After accusing them of being spies, he holds Simeon hostage, sending the brothers back to Canaan on the understanding that they will return with Benjamin. Well, naturally, Jacob is very reluctant to permit this. Later on, we see where Joseph actually accuses them of theft, or actually specifically Benjamin, and an arrangement is reached that Benjamin will stay there while his brothers go back and tell his father what's going on. And all this interaction is taking place between Joseph and his brothers, which shows a great deal of conflicted emotions still taking place within the heart of Joseph, which it does. Genesis 45 provides the climax of the whole story. Which is Genesis 37 through 50. Imagine the feelings of the brothers at Joseph's declaration, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" That's in chapter 45, verse 3. He does not explode in vindictive anger, but is gracious and very compassionate. The text says, read Genesis 45, 4 through 8 carefully, and how does Joseph interpret his many years of affliction? Well, we'll look at that right now. Genesis 45, 4 through 8. Again, this is the climax of all that's taking place interaction between he and his brothers in chapters 42 through 44. 45, well, we'll go back, we'll start in verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Verse 4. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land for these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt." And the question is, how does Joseph interpret his many years of affliction? He interprets this as the plan and providence of God in his life that took place to preserve a remnant of his family and essentially the Israeli race altogether. That's how he interprets the actions that took place by his brothers and the actions that took place in his affliction. It was by God's providence that all this took place. In Genesis 45, verse 16 through chapter 46 through verse 34, we read the moving account of a restoration of Joseph to his father Jacob, who thought that his son was dead. Once Jacob hears the news that Joseph is alive and sees the wagons that Joseph has sent, his spirits revives. The narrator begins to call him Israel consistently from this point forward. What characteristics of Israel, the overcomer, do you see in this section? How is God's blessing seen in his life? Well, what you see is that Joseph actually provides for his brothers and his family, and he sends provisions and wagons full of supplies back to his father. And in chapter 46, Joseph brings his family back to Egypt and gives him everything that he needs to prosper and to live out his life fully, for Jacob to live out his life fully in the land of Egypt. God is continually blessing Israel, through his youngest son, Joseph, who he thought was dead. And God's working all these details out, these situations out, again, for this family's good. And ultimately, he saves them from starvation because of a harsh famine that was on the land at the time. Well, in Genesis 47, 1 through 12, Jacob's family settles in Goshen as shepherds in the land. God had earlier promised Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. How does Jacob advance the prophecy as he appears before Pharaoh? Well, in verse 47, 1 through 12, having primed his brothers, Joseph introduces 5 of them to Pharaoh, mentioning that his family is now in the land of Goshen. When his brothers subsequently respond to Pharaoh's question, they conclude by requesting that they be permitted to dwell in Goshen. Pharaoh grants their request. And then Joseph introduces his father to Pharaoh. The record of this meeting is framed by the repeated comment that Jacob blessed Pharaoh. There was, again, the blessing of the king of Egypt on Jacob. While this can be interpreted as merely denoting words spoken by way of greeting and saying farewell, the image of Jacob blessing Pharaoh takes on special significance when viewed within the context of Genesis as a whole. Here's where the crux is. Genesis presents the special line associated with Abraham and his seed as mediating God's blessing to others. Pharaoh's inquiry about Jacob's age may have been motivated by the belief that longevity was a sign of divine favor. In his response, Jacob perhaps alludes to those events that have made his life less happy, his treatment of Esau and his son's deception of him regarding Joseph. While Jacob is now 130 years old, Abraham and Isaac lived to be 175 and 180, respectively. The Hebrew term sojourning implies that Jacob and his fathers had no permanent abode. This concept is developed along theological lines by the author of Hebrews, who views the patriarchs as looking forward to inhabiting a city that has foundation, whose designer and builder is God. Jacob's comments may indicate that he anticipated something better to come, and something better would come in the form of the family line that would become the nation of Israel, that would later produce, of course, as we know, Christ himself. Well, while Adam and Eve were commanded to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly. But in Egypt, rather than the promised land of Canaan, in light of God's promise to bless all the families of the earth and Abraham's offspring, how shall we put together Israel's multiplying in Egypt with God's desire to bring a blessing to all nations? Well, the nation of Israel began to multiply in Egypt, as we know, because of Jacob and his family being moved to Egypt itself because of the famine that was in the land. Again, God was orchestrating and watching all this and taking care of all this the whole time, And because of their multiplying and becoming greater in number, the race was being preserved for what would eventually become the Exodus, as we read about later on, in which the Israelis would leave Egypt and go back to the promised land that God promised Abraham. And again, so they would be preserved, and later a lineage of Israel itself would later produce, again, as we said earlier, Christ himself. All right, it asks us to read through the following sections of Gospel Glimpses, whole Bible connections, and theological soundings. Take time to reflect upon the personal implications that these selections have for our walk with the Lord. All right, what are some Gospel Glimpses? Well, transformation. God's work in Jacob's life is ongoing. In Genesis 42:4, Jacob is gripped by fear once again. Like his fear meeting Esau, he is afraid to send his son Benjamin to buy grain in Egypt. Only after much convincing does he send Benjamin to Egypt, trusting in God's mercy. Jacob's fear does not, however, exempt him from God's purposes. God continually pursues Jacob, and God himself assures Jacob about the patriarch's own trip to Egypt. This is what God says. I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. That's Genesis 46:3. God's goodness to his children is all out of proportion to what they deserve. And we see this later on fulfilled in Scripture. Well, God in Egypt, some more gospel glimpses. Well, God's work is not limited to the land of Canaan. He saves the family of Israel in Egypt through Joseph. Before Stephen's martyrdom in Acts 7, he recounts a summary of gracious salvation history to demonstrate that God's presence was not limited to the temple in Jerusalem. God appeared to Abraham in Mesopotamia. Again, Acts 7:2. This is Stephen's message. God appeared to Joseph in Egypt, to Moses in the wilderness, to Israel at Mount Sinai. And God cannot be limited to any one location, traveling as he did in the tent of the wilderness. Even Solomon's temple could not contain him. See this in Acts chapter 7, verses 48 through 50. This summary of salvation history provides the theological foundation for the gospel to expand outward from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria. We must not limit God to any one location, but recognize that He is the Lord over all and in all places. Well, what's the definition of temple? Well, temple it's a place set aside as holy because of God's presence there. Solomon built the first temple of the Lord in Jerusalem to replace the portable tabernacle that we read about later in the Exodus. Well, what are some whole Bible connections? Egypt. Well, in Genesis, Egypt is a haven of protection from famine. Abraham flees to Egypt in the face of famine, back in Genesis 12. And Isaac's desire to flee there too, in Genesis 26, verse 1. Just as Isaac was tempted to trust in Egypt in a time of famine, so Egypt embodies the political and military temptation to trust in another nation instead of the Lord in times of crisis. See this in Isaiah chapter 30, 31, 36, also Jeremiah 42 through 43. As Israel commits spiritual adultery with other empires and gods instead of being faithful to the Lord, as seen in Ezekiel 23, while Egypt begins as a place of slavery in Genesis 37 and imprisonment for Joseph, it becomes a place of blessing for Joseph and the family of Israel, as we see in chapter 47 of Genesis. However, with the coming of a new king, Egypt once again becomes a place of slavery, as we see in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. Israel's slavery in Egypt becomes the basis for a call to treat aliens differently in Egypt. Exodus 23, Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 5. You see this. Yet Israel herself becomes oppressive like Egypt, and so suffers Egypt's punishment. See this in Amos chapter 3 and chapter 8. Now in the New Testament, Jerusalem is figuratively called Egypt because of its murder of Christ and his two witnesses, representing martyred believers. See that in Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. Well, some other whole Bible connections. Famine. Well, famine plays a large role in the story of Joseph, just as it did with Abraham and Isaac. In all these contexts, famine provokes migration to a new land, just as it does later for Naomi's husband in Ruth chapter 1, and in the days of Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 8. Famine is later associated with God's judgment. You see this in Deuteronomy 32, 2 Samuel 21, Psalms 105, Isaiah 14 and 51, Jeremiah 11, and also chapter 14 of Jeremiah. It's a curse particularly associated with breaking God's covenant. You see this in Deuteronomy 28. In the new earth, the abundance of Eden will be restored. See that in Amos 9, verses 11 through 15. And those are some whole Bible connections. Well, what are some theological soundings? Well, providence. God's providence does not negate the role of human agency. While the brothers sell Joseph into a caravan, an action they recognize as sin later on, Joseph says, God sent me before you. It was not you who sent me here, but God. God meant it for good, Genesis 50. The good that Joseph recognized is to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to keep alive for you many survivors, Genesis 45. God's providence does not deny human agency. We need to remember that. God is sovereign and humans are responsible. I repeat that. God is sovereign and humans are responsible. This holds true for every human actions that are sinful. Without in any way sinning himself, James chapter 1, verses 13 and 17, God rules providentially even over evil. This is proven when the Bible speaks of God foreordaining the crucifixion of Christ himself. This is in Acts 2, verses 23 through 23, and Acts chapter 4, verses 27 through 28. A rich confidence in divine providence rescues from our hearts becoming mired in resentment and bitterness. If you have a strong conviction and belief in God's providence, it really clears up a lot of issues for us. Well, what's the definition of providence? Well, it's God's good, wise, and sovereign guidance and control of all things by which He supplies all our needs and accomplishes His holy will. Well, personal implications. Well, take some time to reflect on the personal implications of Genesis chapters 42 through 47 for our lives today. Maybe jot down some reflections under the three headings we've considered on the passage as a whole: the gospel glimpses, whole Bible connections, and some theological soundings of these chapters. As we finish, some questions, or a good question to consider. How can a rich understanding of providence rescue your heart from bitterness? Great question. Bring your own resentments for past hurts before the Lord and ask that He would shine a light on His shaping hand of providence in those situations. Great to consider. Well, this concludes our lesson for today in chapter 10. I pray it has enriched you and encouraged your hearts. And with this, let's close in a word of prayer. Father, again, thank you for this day. We thank you for the lesson in the life of Joseph and how you teach us so much through him and the circumstances that surrounded his life, God. We know that your providence is always at work around us and ever working, even when we don't understand it. I pray that we would see that everything that's taken place in our lives has been by your hand, and it's been meant to glorify you and meant for our good. Even the past hurts we've involved, I pray that we would see them as God shaping us to become more and more in the image and likeness of your Son. These things I ask in your name. Amen. Well, it's good to be with you again this week. Look forward to being with you next week, and we'll look at lesson 11. God bless.